Today's guest is Jens.
Many of you will remember Jens,
founder and CEO of Coinstar and New Impact.
Coinstar's 14,000 machines around the world have processed more than $15 billion in change.
Jens Molbak.
Well, thank you so much for being on with me today.
Happy to be on with you today. My story starts in Denmark. My parents were born there in 1925, and they immigrated to the States in 1948 and 1950. But the reason they came is they were, Germany invaded Denmark on April 9th in 1940, and both of my parents' schools were shut down and quarantined. So they had to travel to different schools, and they met because of the war. But when the war ended in 1945, they had seen, some pretty horrific conditions in a country where there was a lack of democracy and a lack of freedom. And Dad was really interested in getting out. And the U.S. at that point in time was considered like the beacon of hope and freedom and strength and resilience in the world. And he came to the U.S. for a year on a American Scandinavian Foundation fellowship. So he came for a year, came to Seattle, fell in love with it, thought it was an amazing country, went back, and he and Mom married in 1950. And he said, this country is so amazing, you got to come visit. So they came on a honeymoon. They only had money to get here one way, and they ended up staying for 5 years, and then went back to Denmark and sort of faced the decision, are they going to build their life in Denmark or come back to the States? And they obviously came back to the States. Became citizens in 1957. But, my sisters and I were all born in the U.S., and so we're American, but we have this Danish heritage. And I think a lot of the work I do today is sort of based on that experience of my parents and their value of democracy, their value of good government. They really like what they call the free enterprise system, things that we would call capitalism today. And they also brought with them a sort of a Nordic sense of egalitarianism. There's a deep history instead of an ethos in the Nordic countries about communitarianism and egalitarianism. And I think I was raised with that. So if you want to start at the beginning, that's kind of the beginning. That thread comes through, a lot of my story, which we can talk about.
Yeah, will you tell me more about that and how you were raised?
Sure. So Mom and Dad, like I said, they came to Seattle, and that's where they started their life. They started a small family business out in Woodinville, Washington. They had a huge goal for us as kids to get educated. Neither of them had gone to college. Mom had technical training as a nurse, and she worked as a nurse here for a long time, and Dad had technical training in the field of horticulture. But education, like I guess a classic immigrant family, was top of the list. And Mom's father and actually her whole family had been involved with the Danish folk high school system. And he had been a headmaster, and so she was really focused on making sure that we got educated. So that was sort of the high priority for all four of us. So that was a strong core family value that we came up with. So, we had to go to school, had to get educated. We all went to college, which was great. But Mom also did things like, we had to recycle. And I remember in the 70s, going to these terrible recycling centers with these dirty old bottles, and we were the only people who were recycling. But she made us do it. And even as a kid, I didn't really like the trip to the recycling center and putting in the back of these, big semi-trailers that were just sitting out waiting to be picked up. But there was a sense of value there that she imparted. And we also got to go off and work in the community. We volunteered at nursing homes, and we also worked in the family business. And one of the first jobs that I got, I was 5, was I was given the job of filling up clay flower pots because we were growing 5-inch and 6-inch mum pots. And my job as a 5-year-old was to put dirt in the pot, which looking back, they told me it was a job, but I think it was really childcare while they were working that I'd just be out filling pots. But then as I got a little bit older, at 10, they came to me and they gave me this opportunity. They said, hey, we have another job for you involving pots. And Dad, after he'd been using all these clay pots, he had thousands of them sitting out in the field, and they were all covered in algae. And he says, I need you to clean them. So we'll set up a pot washing station, and I'll pay you a penny a pot to scrub these old pots and make them like new, which was a lot cheaper than buying a new one. And so over the next year and a half, I watched 28,000 5 and 6 inch mum pots, cleaned them all up, earned $280.
Wow.
And used that money to buy a plane ticket to go to Denmark to visit my grandparents and my family. So that was kind of fun. So I have lots of childhood stories that are sort of mom and dad kind of, weaving in all these things. And I guess the last one I'll say for now is they also really cared about voting, right? Because they'd seen what happens when a democracy fails, right? And an autocracy takes over. Dad, he's working on 99 now, and he has very strong memories of World War II, which we talk about. So when it came time to vote, we would talk about the election issues, and it was very important. They became citizens in 1957, and they had to study, extensively the citizenship test in 1957, which I have the originals of. It's really hard. I couldn't pass it today without studying. It's a really extensive test, and I have the thick citizenship book. But that was just part of the conversation. So I grew up in a family that talked about community values and community service, talked about, small businesses and how to grow a small business and the importance of government. And that's a lot of my background, which looking back, it makes sense to me why I'm doing what I'm doing now. But at the time, I just thought it was the way we were raised. Didn't really think that much about it.
It's incredible how much, looking back, everything you see kind of the thread that goes and runs through.
Yeah.
What about the next stage of your life, maybe college, and when you started having to make choices about what your future was going to look like?
Sure. I was lucky enough to go to a great private high school here in Seattle called Lakeside, which is well known. I felt like I got a really solid education and sort of a love for learning, and it was very much aligned with mom and dad's values of try to figure out the best education we can for the kids. So when it came time to go to college, for some reason I felt the urge to go east, having been born and raised, on the West Coast. And my high school sport was rowing. So I'm tall. I don't know if you can tell in the camera.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, just a little bit. So I'm 6'7". And I really enjoyed rowing in high school. And I applied to schools east that had crew teams and ended up going to Yale. And rowed there for 4 years and studied both psychology and biology. And it was a great time. I'm deeply grateful for, made lots of great friends at Yale and learned a lot, and ended up with a degree in psychology and biology. I thought I was going to be a doctor, but then I quickly realized I didn't want to be a doctor and kind of shift gears.
I'm curious about that. What made you kind of change your mind?
Well, I was thinking about this for this podcast, and one of the things I did a lot and still do is, I talk to people who are older than me, just kind of asking their advice for what they, what they suggest for younger people. So I ended up going to visit some people who were doctors who were, at the ripe age of 40 or 45, which seems young to me now. And I realized I didn't really like the environment and the work. And I was like, well, do I really want to have a lifetime of work in this area that doesn't really kind of speak to me deeply? So I shifted out of biology to psychology. And I thought about a degree in clinical psychology because I got really interested in terms of how people think and how they operate. And so that was something that was sort of an undergrad piece, but I ended up going into investment banking. And everybody said, if you can take a year off before you start working, do it. And I'd saved up some money, not a lot. I thought, okay, it'd be interesting to take a year off, and what would that look like? And I traveled for 13 months. But before I left, I thought, I better get some interview experience. So I asked around and what were the hardest interviews on campus, and they were these investment banking interviews, and I didn't even know what an investment bank was. So I threw my resume in completely casually with no intention of ever doing it. And I think because I was relaxed about it, I ended up getting a job offer. It turns out they also like to hire athletes and rowers and people who knew how to work hard and work consistently. So I was kind of stunned. I got this offer from something I didn't really understand, and they had over-admitted the number of applicants that year, and I asked if they'd hold my spot for a year, and they said yes. So I spent a year traveling on the cheap, went through India and Nepal, Southeast Asia, sailed across the South Pacific, from New Zealand to Tahiti. Had a beard and long hair and all that sort of good stuff, which was fun. And I went right from that to getting cleaned up and going to Wall Street and learning how to run the spreadsheet.
What was that transition like? Was there ever just a gap where you were just like, oh, this world is so different now?
It is different, but I was ready. I really enjoyed that travel life, and I think it was, was curious about the world. And I'll tell you one quick story. I remember when I called my parents up to tell them that I was thinking about, traveling on the cheap, sleeping on the beach and, spending 6 cents or something in India for something. Dad's like, you sound kind of crazy. You're going to disappear. You just got an education. Shouldn't you go off and get a job? I'm like, Dad, you left your home country and went away for a couple of years and then left for 40. I'm just talking about, going away for a year and then coming back. And he's like, okay, have a good time. So that was funny. So it was a shift, but I also felt ready. I was like, it was nice to get the wanderlust, and my standard line from that phase, I felt educated but not particularly wise. And after I traveled for a while, I felt a little wiser, a little bit, as wise as you can be when you're 22 or 23.
I like that phrase, educated but not wise yet.
When you're an undergrad, you study a lot of stuff, right? But you haven't done much in the world yet. At least I hadn't at that point. So I didn't really have a sense of how the world actually, had actually worked. So, but I'd gone to a good school and I'd done well, and I felt like, I had fabulous professors. Not all were fabulous, but most were fabulous. And I just felt like, okay, I've gotten, I've been really blessed with a great education. I mean, I've gotten to go to some of the best educational institutions in the country, and I'm deeply grateful for that. But, the education isn't worth anything unless you can do something with it and, make a contribution with it. So that was the sense of like, okay, I just had this sense inside of me like, education's great, I'm happy for it, but I got to get out and sort of see more of what's happening. And, oh my God, traveling through India and seeing, real poverty for the first time, and seeing how most of the world lives as opposed to the little enclave here in the Pacific Northwest, that was eye-opening. I remember getting back the first day, and I'd surprised my parents, actually a surprised Mom. I told Dad I was coming back. And they left me home alone that first morning because I had some stuff to go off to do. And I just remember like opening the fridge and like, oh my God, there's easy food that's just right here, and going to the supermarket and being overwhelmed by the choices, which is obviously really different from other parts of the world. So I'm happy for that experience.
So tell me a little bit about what happened when you came back and started in investment banking and what that world was like.
Well, I think investment banking, I spent 2 years doing it, and I'd say it demystified what happened in those tall glass buildings in New York. I worked a year as a real estate analyst, and a year as a banking analyst, and I learned how to run spreadsheets and learned about net present value and those sort of things. And you work really hard. It was like 80, 90, 100-hour week type things for a couple of years. But I had this sense it was deep experience, a deep exposure. And most people went directly to business school out of these 2-year analyst programs. And I just decided that I wasn't ready to go to business school. And I kind of looked ahead at the people who were older, 40, 50. I was like, I'm not sure that the way they're living their lives speaks to me. So maybe there's a different path out there. So I ended up not going to business school right out of banking. I was given an opportunity to go to Virginia, to Charlottesville, and help a doctor there create a new neuroscience center that was going to unite patient care education and research. And it was sort of like a detox from New York. Like, first time I got there, I was like, oh my God, where are the 24-hour delis? And I realized, oh, you get to just sleep. And it was a great year to be in Charlottesville. But when I was there, I realized that I actually did want to go to business school. But I was really interested in schools that weren't traditional. So the two that were most interesting to me were Stanford's business school, because they had a public management program, and then Yale had the School of Organization and Management, which is, I would call Yale the original trisector school these days. So anyway, I ended up going to Stanford, and that kind of led into Coinstar, and it fed my, my interest in the strength and power of private sector companies and the importance of nonprofit organizations and the work they do in society. and also just good government. I was really grateful for my time at Stanford, being able to research and study that, which led to the Coinstar story.
Before we talk about the Coinstar story, I wanted to ask if there were any lessons or memories that led up to this point that maybe you had to endure and learn before you were able to go and build Coinstar and New Impact.
Yeah, I mean, I've had lots of failures and things that haven't gone well in my life. I would say at that point, the things that I think shaped me were, looking back, I didn't think about myself as a college athlete, but I had a good college athletic career. And if I think back to sort of the daily discipline of rowing and crew, there was just a lot about showing up every day and just doing the work. And I remember the first time we won a major race. I was a sophomore, and we were fast, and we won the national championship that year, which was fun. But leading up to that, we crossed the finish line at the Eastern Sprints, and we won. Like, this was like a big goal. And I was kind of looking around like, where are the fireworks? Like, where's the... And it was this sense of like, oh yeah, what everybody tells you, it's like, it's not the, it's about the journey, not the destination. So I was having one of those, real lived experiences about, okay, it really is about the daily work and what you do every day that matters. And I think that that work ethic and focus has stayed with me a lot. So I would say at that phase in my life, really, consistency, dedication, showing up, doing the work, and being focused on the task at hand that isn't public, that isn't seen. The work that only you know that you're doing is the work that that's where I guess I got some conviction just to kind of, follow the work that you're doing. If you believe in it, persevere. In fact, I'll tell you, there was I took a lot of entrepreneurship classes, and one of them was from a professor who's no longer alive, Bill Lazier, and he'd run a lot of companies, and he partnered with Jim Collins, who wasn't famous at that point in time, but is now. And Lazier handed out at the end of his classes sort of one page or two-sided one-pager with his life lessons on it. And there are just a bunch of quotes that mattered to him. And some of the quotes really, stood out to me. One of them was, if you truly believe, persevere in something and hang in there. There was another one, he had a quote from Gandhi about service has no meaning unless one takes pleasure in it. I really liked that one. And his bottom one was always watch the cash. So those were some of the highlights from grad school. And I met fabulous people and great friends and stuff. I feel really lucky with the friendships I've made over my life, both from high school, college, and grad school.
Yeah, it's incredible to me that most of your work goes unseen. It's like all the hard work and all the labor, and then at race day, it's just maybe that one moment. But everyone always looks at that one moment when it's all the time leading up to it.
And there's nothing magic about race. It's not like, something extra happens. It's just doing what you've done all the time and getting, consistently making it better and better. I remember talking to my high school coach, and he said, in a 2,000 meter race, you might take 200 strokes or 210 strokes, and if 20 or 30 of those can be really, really good, you're doing great. So that consistency of the repetition and just trying to get it right. It reminds me actually of there was a lecture that I attended when I was an undergrad, and it was a Japanese calligraphy master who came, and he was talking about the art of calligraphy. And he starts off about talking about dedication and consistently and trying to perfect, emotion. And he's like drawing these beautiful letters with this beautiful brush. And I'm, sitting nodding knowingly like, yeah, I've been rowing for 6 years and trying to get this stroke right. And he said, I'll never forget, he said, I've been trying to draw a straight line for 30 years every day. And I'm like, oh, I'm just a babe in the woods. I haven't even started. This guy's like way down the path about trying to get something right. A straight line every day for 30 years, and he's still practicing. But yeah, that rings true.
Well, I'm wondering what your straight line is metaphorically. What are you still working at that you're trying to
Oh, that's a
hone?
good one. I mean, I'm over 60 now. I'm 61. I think this sense of trying to live each day in a way that feels like I'm making good choices in the moment. If I can go to bed at night and feel like I've made authentic choices during that day, that's a good day. And to be able to do that consistently day after day, I still can't do it. But it's something that I aspire to, that daily living, that moment-to-moment living.
I saw somewhere actually where you mentioned that you would write down at the end of the day, I think, some of the things that made you feel most alive in life or things you were grateful for.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that and what some of those things are for you that really make life
Sure.
alive?
I started that list. I use an iPhone and there's that little notepad on it. So I just started using the notepad. And when I hit 50, I was thinking about what does the next 10 years look like, or what would I like to look like? And I just started, I didn't have a plan. This was before founding New Impact. And I was like, okay, I want to do things that make me feel alive. So I just started paying attention to moments when I would, feel alive. So it'd be things like, walking outside and on a hike. Well, I'll write that down. Hanging out and talking with friends, laughing and telling stories. I love innovating. I love collaborating. So I think over the course of a year and a half, I haven't looked at the list in a while. I probably had like 150 things on the list, and it was kind of like, okay, these are the things that make me feel alive. And for this next phase of my life, what are the things that I want to be doing in terms of my daily actions that reinforce this? So I was just curious. I couldn't have told you what my staying alive list looked like before I wrote it, but I collected it over a period of time. It was, it wasn't like a big project. It was just something like, oh, that feels kind of good. Let me just make a quick note of that. So that's, 60 seconds out of your day to do something like that.
It's all the little things.
Yeah, little things and big things. They tend to add up, though, over time.
Wow. Let's hear about Coinstar, if you will share how that was founded and where you came up with the idea.
Sure. I'm happy to go into the Coinstar story. So there's kind of several ways to tell it, but I will tell you when I got to Stanford, they essentially it's a university and a business school that really believes in entrepreneurship. And so when you show up on campus, they essentially shove an IV in your arm and they say, you're going to learn about entrepreneurship for the next 2 years. And because it's based in Silicon Valley, they have all these amazing stories, and they just run a parade of people through the classrooms, and business schools are done on case studies and whatnot. And it was really fascinating to hear these stories, not only what had worked well, but what hadn't worked well. And so I was just around a culture that valued entrepreneurship. I thought I was a spreadsheet jockey from an investment bank in New York and never considered myself really to be an entrepreneur. But one of the lessons you take away in listening to a lot of people who've engaged in entrepreneurship is pay attention to what's around you. And I'd moved a lot from Seattle to New Haven to New York to Virginia and then back west. And I was kind of lazy. What had always followed me around was this ever-increasing jar of coins, this big mason jar. And when I was a kid, I washed flower pots. I knew there was value. I knew the pennies added up to value. And another job I had at the Family Garden Center was emptying out the pot machine, soda machine if you're from the East Coast. And we had to sort out all the pennies, nickels, dimes, and quarters and be able to deposit in the bank. But that involved putting in these little paper wrappers and then taking to the bank and depositing. And it was just a lot of work. So I stopped doing it. So this coin jar just got bigger and bigger. And when I was in business school, I was like, well, if I want to pay attention, if people find opportunities from their daily life, there's this thing sitting on my dresser top, right? And I just got curious about it. So, I wrote a letter to the Mint and to the Fed. Said, I'm a grad student. I'm studying our coin supply. How many coins have you manufactured and stuff? And what I learned over the course of the time there was they'd manufactured about $15 billion worth of physical coin stock to supply the U.S. economy. That was interesting. I thought about maybe the banks ought to put a machine in, but I'm like, well, how would you actually make a business out of that? Then I thought, well, if it was in the supermarket, right, then you could have a machine that could count coins, because my old bank used to have one way back in the day before they took it out. Then maybe you could charge a fee for it. And I was talking to an entrepreneurship professor, and I was telling him about this idea, and I remember these words very clearly because he was a highly successful entrepreneur, a guy named Irv Grousbeck. And he said, I think that idea merits further consideration. And I was like, okay, well, if Grossbeck thinks it merits further consideration, I'm going to get on this. So I stacked my classes 2 days a week my second year, and I spent the other time hanging outside of Bay Area supermarkets. Hi, I'm a grad student. Do you have any coins? And what I figured out was out of that 15 billion of physical coin stock that had been manufactured, roughly half of it was sitting on America's dresser tops. So there was $7 billion, which was our collective savings. But it also meant that the other 8 billion circulated. It actually supplied all the cash transactions and all the cash registers across the country. And I'd taken a macro class, so I got interested in stocks and flows. And what I realized was that 8 billion turned over 20 times a year and created a $150 billion market. Wow. I'm like, this is really interesting. So there's $150 billion worth of coins going through consumers' hands. They're a pain to sort of use. 25% of people just use them all the time, just spend exact change. 75% of us, go through the change process. And I was like, well, there could be a really interesting market there. And if there was a machine in a supermarket that could get out, that could be interesting. But I also thought back to some of the career advice I'd gotten in New York, because when I was leaving Morgan Stanley and heading to Virginia and was not going to business school, I asked people about sort of different career paths. And I said, well, how would you think about doing this? Because I'm interested in the private sector. I'm also interested in nonprofits. It's something that, I've been raised with. And I'm also interested in government and public service. And the advice I got in 1986, which is not the advice you get today, was first go to the private sector and get yourself established, earn some financial security for yourself and your future family. Then go to the social sector, maybe volunteer at a soup kitchen, or or maybe serve on a board. If you're lucky, become a philanthropist. Then after that, you can, run for office and, do your give back as a public servant. And then you'd retire, and then you'd die. And I called that my 5-part career path. And that seemed uninteresting to me, that you would have to kind of do these things in sequence. So when I started thinking about Coinstar, I was asking myself the question, could you do all 3 of those things together? So here was an opportunity for a private sector coin recycling business. And then I thought about the history of coins and charity. Things like March of Dimes and Salvation Army and charities have long used coins as a source of fundraising. I'm like, oh my goodness, we can actually use the machines to raise money for nonprofits. That's interesting. And then I thought more about the impact Coinstar would have at scale if it really worked. And then I realized we'd create a national coin recycling program, which would have a huge impact of cost savings on the Fed and the Mint. I'm like, okay, I'm 26. I'm getting out of grad school. I have this idea that's kind of interesting. I had a lot of consumer research saying people want to do this. I can, think about a business that serves my government interests, my nonprofit interests, and my for-profit interests all at once. Let's go for it.
And it goes back to your childhood recycling, and then also your story about collecting and saving little moments, and now coins.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, I think Mom would take credit for Coinstar because of all the pot washing. Maybe that's true, could be true, certainly a part of it, but seeing value in things and then recycling them. But that was really motivating to me. And what was also exciting is I was, working with a lot of friends and going to school with a lot of friends who also cared about doing well and doing good, which was the terminology of the time. Now things like social entrepreneurship and other terms get used. But that was motivating. And I got out there and did more research and tried to raise some money and quickly realized it was going to be hard. And a lot of people thought it was a silly idea and a project. And I got no money out of Silicon Valley and no money from venture capitalists. And I ended up raising the first $500,000 from people who I knew, largely here in Seattle, Puget Sound Venture Club. And that was the hardest money I ever raised. But Coinstar worked, right? We had 5 rounds of private money. We took the company public. We raised debt, and we scaled it. I ran that business for 11 years, and it was an honor to be able to go from an idea to a public company. Not many people get to see that journey. And worked really hard. That was most of my 30s. But it was great to see. And I got tremendous satisfaction. I like to say that, I had a good day in 1998. And I remember I'd been having a conversation, I think, that morning with the UK Mint, because we were expanding to the UK. And we've been talking to UNICEF about their Trick or Treat for UNICEF campaign. And I had some other call in the private sector. And I came home that day and I was like, wow, I wanted to work in all three sectors at once. And I just had that day. So I had a lot of pride in what we did at Coinstar. Maybe, a couple of stories about Coinstar that aren't as obvious to people. People know about the business side, but on the government side, it's the story I tell is, I think, illustrative, especially when we get into the work that I'm doing now. So we were growing quickly, and we were, trying to figure this out and making things up as we went. And we had our largest rollout at the time, which was in Los Angeles with Ralph's and Vaughn's supermarkets. And I think we put out 100 machines in like a couple weeks or something. And I got back to Seattle, and I had a call from the Fed, and we'd never heard from the Fed. And the call was, who are you? What are you doing? The West Coast has canceled all future penny orders because you're swamping them with all these recycled pennies. Come to Washington, D.C. and explain yourself. And at first, we're like high-fiving each other because we're like, yeah, this is working. But then we're like, oh, my God, the Fed called. And they don't sound very happy with us. So now what? But anyway, we went to see the Fed, and they fell in love with us. After they figured out who we were and what we were doing, they're like, this is amazing, right? Because they quickly saw that if we scaled the way we were planning to scale, that we would essentially create all these local recycling phenomena instead of having two manufacturing facilities, one in Denver and one in Philadelphia, where they produce all these metal discs of different shapes and sizes, and they have to ship them to every zip code in the country to make the cash system work, and then half of them go missing. It's a crappy product, right? We essentially, in all those zip codes, had recycling phenomena, right? So they could, dramatically reduce the new coins that they had to manufacture, and then also the shipping costs. Wow. So they were really excited, but they were also confused, right? Because they're like, wait a second, our job at the Fed is to regulate the monetary supply and regulate banks, and you're not a bank, so we can't regulate you, and you're not a supplier, so we don't have a contract. What do we do with you? What's our relationship? And we're like, we built our business model to align with your interests. So you don't have to do anything. You've already made the market. You've already created this coin asset. Now just sit back and take the benefits of that. And that was powerful. They were really excited. And they helped us in many ways. So, the following year I got a call from the Royal Mint in the UK. That was a great call to get. They're like, hey, we're just talking to the Fed in the US. You're saving the US government all this money. Will you come do the same thing in the UK? We're like, sure, we'll get on a plane for that. And flew over there and met with them. They were very excited. And they're like, right, what do you need to roll out the UK? And we're like, well, we need all the supermarkets and the banks and the armored carriers. Anyway, they set up all the meetings that week, and we rolled out 1,000 machines, I think, in 6 months, which was super fast. And what I like to say is that our private sector shareholders got the benefit of that, really great rollout because we had a public sector benefit, right? It was integrated, right? It was a win-win type of approach. So that was a really powerful lesson from Coinstar about how a for-profit business can work with a government entity to do, something that's not life-changing, but, Coinstar has saved billions.
Thank you to the University Bookstore for sponsoring this episode. I'm really curious about something you said earlier in the conversation about your one good day, and then also that, that 30 in your 30s when you had that period between idea and actually having it happen. So what was that time in your life like?
Busy. Busy. It was a time there was a lot of work to do, raising a young family, trying to figure this stuff out. The company was changing all the time. It started off with one person. I think when I left we had, 700 or 800. So you're constantly trying to figure out what's the next set of skills you need to lead a company. It's one thing to lead a company that's got a Series A financing, done. It's another thing to lead a company that's publicly traded in New York, and you have to talk to equity players and debt players. So there was always this, endless need to keep learning, and work expands to fill the time. So it was a very busy time. I don't think I've worked as hard since that period of time.
Wow. You said learning. What's your way of learning? How did you continue? Was it books? Was it talking to people? Was it?
Some books, some talking to people. There's a few business books that I've relied on a lot. I think a lot of learning by example, and being curious about what other people have done. We had a terrific board of older advisors who helped kind of take the rocks out of the way. So I think this, in general, how do I learn? I mean, read some. I wish I read more. But I think a lot of learning by example, learning by doing, and curiosity. And I try to pay attention to what's going on.
Did you have any learning by failure, maybe? And
Oh, yeah, lots.
can you tell us about some of them? Or
Well, yeah, I don't know where you want to start. I mean, the classic thing is, you want to fail fast forward, right? So there were lots of things that we did. In the very beginning, Coinstar was going to be doing exchanging coins and coupons, right? We're going to have discounts in the store. That was another failure. We didn't have the scale for it. So there were lots of pivots along the way. But we were talking a little bit about failure, and I would say, even what I'm doing right now with New Impact, which is we're trying to, we're running a very small 501c3 nonprofit with this, big idea of helping the world, solve important problems at scale faster. And I've been banging away on this for 10 years. And in some ways, I feel like we've learned a lot. I've learned a lot for sure. But, we've also haven't grown the way that I thought that we would. So, right now I'm in the process of trying to reflect on what are we learning from the market? When do we persevere, right? And just hang in there with something that everything's telling us is right. Maybe we're early. And when do we pivot? So we're always kind of, playing around with these ideas about when to persevere and when to pivot. And the reality is you don't know if you made the right call until later. When you're in the moment having to make that decision, there's not a lot of signposts that tell you, oh, go this way or go that way. So I think, I have a pretty analytical left brain, but I make my decisions with my right brain that are intuitive and a sense of sort of pattern recognition, I would say.
wow, it's always interesting to me when people talk about the left versus right side of the brain. And it's fascinating to me when I meet someone who uses both regularly or has developed both. So I'm wondering if there was anything that you did, throughout your life that contributed to maintaining both sides and
Sure.
using both.
Well, I think I mentioned as an undergrad, I went into psychology and biology, and my senior thesis was on left brain, right brain hemisphere stuff. And I just had this premise like, God, why not? I mean, there was some stat like we only use 10% of our brain or 5%. And I was like, well, why can't we use more and certainly use both sides with that? So, I think, in Western education, you get pretty trained on analytical, logical thought, which is helpful. But I think right brain has, equally valuable but different pieces to it. I follow a, daily regime of, meditation and yoga and try to get out of my left brain and turn that off. I try to pay attention to right brain stuff. There were some books that were fun in the 70s. I'm going to sound really date myself, called Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. That was fun. I used to do pottery in high school, and there was a book on centering about, how to center the clay. So I think working with your hands is helpful. I think being outside in nature is helpful. Forests are amazing. Mountains are amazing. A good day for me is when I can get outside and do something active. And I think that helps you get out of sort of that quantitative spreadsheet. But the reality is I always have a spreadsheet running on one side of my brain. It just runs there, and I can pay attention to it, but I don't like to use it too much. These days I use more of a calendar. It's like, because, it's more about time management. So how do I want to spend my time?
That's so cool to me how with Coinbase and now Coinstar.
Coinbase is something different.
Coinstar, and now with New Impact, you're taking the private sector and the public sector, and you're taking all these things together. And then in your own life, you also took psychology and biology and all these different subjects, and then left and right brain to kind of create and merge something completely new.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about that way, and it's even funny now with New Impact. We're encouraging people to use all the resources in the world, and the analogy we use is Lego blocks. I grew up with a bunch of Lego blocks, but just going to New Impact world for a little bit. There's, we've been kind of researching this for a while, but we think if you ignore the money in the world and ignore derivatives, Just look at the things that have been built, right? There's like $500 trillion worth of value between buildings and trucks and stuff that have been built by private sector, social and public sector. And part of what we're thinking about is, if we've got if all these Lego blocks that represent all these amazing resources, whether it be a database or a set of connections or whatever, how can you use them? Pick them up and build something interesting. So, maybe some stuff from childhood when I had a lot of Lego blocks to play with, and you could, it wasn't paint by number Lego kits that you buy today where you just, you're going to get this thing. You could just kind of do more free form. I like that kind of stuff.
I think I'd love to hear more about New Impact because I know that's what you're currently working on right now. So will you share what's been going, or I guess what is New Impact and how is it founded, and then we can go into what you're doing today.
So New Impact is the lion's share of my work today. I kind of have some other things I do as well, but it's a public good. We call ourselves a humanity benefit organization. And as I said before, we're really, one way to think about us is we're business model innovators, and that could be business models for private sector businesses or for nonprofit organizations. They have a business model too, or even for government agencies. So we think about our business model innovators, and we think if we're going to help contribute to solving, important problems at scale faster, we need to rethink how our organizations are built with what we call the trisector mindset. So let's use all the resources that are out there. So we do three things at New Impact. One is we're trying to create this mindset about thinking this way, which we call trisector innovation. It's really just a whole of society approach. It's common sense. It's nothing magic. We just happen to use this hashtag trisector innovation. It'd be akin to things like design thinking, if you're familiar with design thinking as a school of thought, or agile methodology, or human-centered design. We think it's a really important mindset shift that can be created that can help people build and structure their organizations better. So first thing we do is we pioneer and promote this mindset. And the second thing we do is we build tools for innovators. So we have a variety of tools that are available to people who want to, accelerate or deepen or change their company or their nonprofit or their government, but primarily companies at this phase. And we're excited about these tools. We test them with universities. We have professors use them. We teach them in accelerators and incubators. We have investment funds that are interested in applying it to portfolio companies, whether that's venture stage or private equity stage. And we've even done work for Fortune 100s on this. So we have tools and a process, and we're just starting to experiment with AI now. We're really excited about the possibilities that AI holds for social good, for helping people find resources. And then the third thing we do is we do coaching and advisory work. We're very dedicated to being a nonprofit and being a public good, but we also help, so that means we're not going to be a consulting company, and we're not going to be an investment advisory firm, or we're not going to run a fund, all of which we could be doing, which frankly would be a lot easier than trying to build a scaled global public good, but we can get to that later. But we do really enjoy sort of advising organizations. So, for instance, last week I was in New York, and we were working with an incubator called Blue Ridge, which is part of Robinhood. Robinhood's a big New York poverty that's focused on big New York nonprofit that's focused on poverty alleviation in the New York area. And part of their accelerator team is something called Blue Ridge, and we love Blue Ridge. They're one of the best accelerators in the country that do a lot of fintech work. Anyway, we were brought in to teach our content and our tools and our methodology, and there were 7 early-stage companies that are applying AI to education, also benefits access. So that's really fun. Like, we get to come in with a bunch of, eager, motivated people who, give a damn and want to make a difference, and if we can help them accelerate in their journey and, build a model like Coinstar or like Propel, which we can talk about too. And Propel, actually, the food stamp company, came out of Blue Ridge. So that was fun, right? But, the same trip, we're also meeting with the UN. And, I think the UN, where we've had many meetings, and also with the World Bank, they're trying to solve big problems at scale, globally. And they have these things called the global goals. I don't know if you're familiar with the 17 global goals or have seen them. Or
I think I've seen them.
Yeah. So they've done a great job kind of organizing. There are things like, poverty, hunger, stronger cities, gender equality, a whole bunch of things out there. And what we've been encouraging them to think about is if you're going to be able to create a methodology to solve those and to fund them, they think it's going to take $5 to $7 trillion annually to pay for all those things. We got to start thinking about repurposing the existing resources. So we've been developing an AI tool that can help them actually find resources and then repurpose them around the SDGs. So it's fun. We're developing this methodology, this mindset. We're developing tools, and then we get to talk to lots of different types of innovators, very small ones, very big ones. And I like to say at New Impact, we're not focused on the what you're actually doing, whether it's housing or mental health or climate, take your pick. We're focused on how you do it. So we're very interested in the methodology and the creation of the model, which goes back to, the design of the business model at Coinstar. And I can tell you the Propel story if you want to hear that, because I think that company does a great job, highlighting what trisector innovation is all about.
Sure. Yeah.
So if people don't know about it, I'd encourage you to look up Propel and their providers app. And I met Jimmy and Jeff maybe close to 10 years ago now, and I'd been lecturing at Stanford about Coinstar. And I was telling these stories about, hey, we integrate with government and nonprofits. And someone said, hey, there's a couple of guys working at this accelerator in New York called Blue Ridge, and they're thinking about revamping the food stamp system. And I'm like, well, that sounds super interesting. So I met with them a couple of times, and I was really intrigued and impressed by what they were up to. And they were both talented and smart, and they kind of went off the Silicon Valley tech path, and they said, we want to do tech for good and people who may not be getting terrific apps. And the use case they identified in the beginning was the food stamp program. So just for context, for your listeners, food stamps are the food stamp program is known as SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and it's run by USDA. And it's about a $115 billion federal program. And essentially the USDA ships out $115 billion to each state. And then the states do have a variety of pieces, but they essentially implement a debit card. And if you qualify for food stamps, and 1 in 7 people do in the U.S., so 1 in 7 people in the country is food insecure, which is amazing or ridiculous if you think about us being the country that we are. And we've been stuck at that number for a long time. But they give out these debit cards, and they load up about $200 a month. So when you go to the grocery store to, check out and buy groceries, you can pay with cash or credit or, debit, or there's something that says EBT, and that's electronic benefits transfer. And what Propel realized is that, after about 2 weeks, someone who's on food stamps with that debit card, they're starting to run out of money, and they need to know how much money is left on their card. So they created a balance checking app. They figured out a way to go into the back door of these databases and put an app on someone's phone that says, hey, you've got, $25 left on your card. And the benefit to the shopper was they don't have to go to the check stand and potentially be embarrassed, say, oh, not enough money. So it's really interesting. So they're showing that to me. I'm like, that's amazing. How do you get that data? And they explained that to me. And then I asked them a question, what else can you do? And they said, oh, we can help her do budgeting, and we can help her see how much she spends at supermarket A or supermarket B. And I'm like, that's not balance data, that's actually transaction data. And I'm like, oh yeah, we get transaction data too, which is incredibly powerful. So they have market share data on up to $115 billion of spending power in the U.S. supermarket industry. But anyway, they created an app that not only did balance checking, but started to get discounts and other value for shoppers that was really powerful. And then using a trisector approach, they said, well, if you're on food stamps, what else might be out there that'd be useful to you? So it turns out most farmers markets will double the value of food stamp benefits. If you show up, and that's a federally funded program that's implemented through cities. So they downloaded the geolocation of farmers markets, which is an open database, put it on their app, and all of a sudden someone on food stamps could get fresh, healthy vegetables and got $40 of value for $20. That was kind of cool. And then they started to integrate other social sector services like finding a job or childcare or housing or heating assistance. So Propel has really kind of taken a human-centered design approach, thinking about that person who's food insecure, and then the app brings together resources from the government, whether that's city, county, state, or federal, resources from the social sector and resources from the private sector to really make this very powerful app. And it's a for-profit company. They're having huge change on the federal social safety net. They're backed by some of the best venture capitalists in the country, Andreessen Horowitz and Kleiner Perkins. And what I love about their story is the trisector story, very similar to Coinstar, and they've also been able to attract, really hardcore private sector capital. And I think Propel and Coinstar are examples of the opportunity then in front of us if we can get more and more organizations to think this way and actually embed impact into the core of the model. So when you start to think about terms like social entrepreneurship or social benefit, I think that I think that becomes too sector specific. So what I like about Coinstar and Propel is I think they create societal benefit, which is we're all part of society and we're all trying to figure out how to make societies work better. And, Coinstar is doing one thing, Propel is doing something else. And there's lots of other trisector models out there that we're encouraging that we think can really be, like I said, the gold standard. And part of our job at New Impact is to really encourage the teaching and adoption and implementation of these trisector models because we think they're fundamental. We think they're the most powerful models you can build. So we're out there screaming about them all the time.
You said that New Impact's changed you more than you've changed it, and I'm curious about that.
Yeah, it's I've spent a lot of time the last 10 years in the nonprofit sector, talking to organizations, talking with people who are working with people who are on the social safety net. I mean, it's, I mentioned 1 in 7 people in the country is food insecure. I think something like now, like 60% of the country doesn't have $500 of savings. And this is the United States, the wealthiest country in the world. And we have a population that has, no savings. We've looked at lots of other social safety net programs, whether it's Section 8 housing or Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid. And it is hard. Life is hard and it's mentally stressful. And it is, I'm not proud of how we operate. And it was part of my motivation for actually founding New Impact because it's like, I turned 50 and I was thinking about what was next. And I just realized that there was an opportunity to do better. And I felt like, I'd done some work with government. I felt like they were losing me in my 40s. And I'm like, wait a second, they're losing me, someone who's raised by parents who really care about citizenship. Who else are they losing? And, as I've gotten closer to how the systems actually work, I don't like what I see, and we need to change it. I feel a deep sense of urgency that we are not making societal progress fast enough. And if we don't start doing things differently, then I get concerned. Whether you take big issues like climate or go down any one of the issues, we could. So I just, so how it's changed me, I think my eyes are much more open to what life is like for many people. But at the same time, it's just frustrating because I can see so many better ways that this could happen. And I think the types of solutions can be very pragmatic and are very much in reach, but we're not making a concerted and a deliberate effort. I mean, a lot of stuff I talk about, people say, well, it's just common sense. I'm like, right, it should be common sense. The problem is it's not common practice. So we'll come, and teach at a university or teach in an accelerator incubator, and people are like, oh my God, here's actually a way to unite profit and purpose in a way that's actually synergistic, where it's not concessionary, right? When I talk to investors, I'm like, every one of your portfolio companies should be looking for a trisector strategy, not because it's the right thing to do, because it's the smart thing to do and it's the right thing to do. And it's just wiser. I mean, go to Coinstar and try to pull out either UNICEF or the Fed or the Coinstar model. It's a worse model. It's better because all three are together, right? Same thing with Propel. The model itself is stronger, but you have to know how to design these things. And it turns out they're easy to talk about, but it takes some work to be able to design it because this isn't taught yet and the tools aren't quite there, which is why we're excited by this AI thing. We're like, oh my God, maybe we actually have a tool. So we're training a bot that can actually help people find resources. This is very new. We demoed it last week in New York, and we're pretty excited by it.
Wow. So where do you hope to see New Impact go? What's your vision for it?
It's a huge vision, right? I mean, it started off small, like, oh, we can do this for companies. And then we realized, well, if you can do it for companies, you can do it for nonprofits. And if you can do it for nonprofits, you can do it for governments. And if you can do it for governments in the U.S., you can do it for governments other places. And before COVID hit, I think I mentioned I probably had 30 or maybe even 40 meetings between the World Bank and the UN. And they were really interested in the methodology. I remember when the World Bank called us up, and we did a lot of lunch and learns then, and the group that was interested in us was something called the Billions to Trillions group, which is like, oh my God, if we have to fund all this stuff in the world, where's all this new money going to come from? And part of our message is there's not enough new money in the world to pay for all the changes we want to see. So we have to get much smarter about repurposing the $500 trillion that's out there. If we can use an asset that was built for purpose A, but also used for B, C, D, and E, then that's money you don't have to spend. You just get more value about it. And I can tell you lots of stories about that repurposing. But I guess the size of the vision, evolved when we realized that it was a way of thinking. It was sort of, people use this term systems change approach, which I don't like to use because systems change means different things to different people, but it is systemic, right? It's if you want to get really conceptual, this is, I'm a capitalist. I, believe in capitalism, and capitalism has brought us to where we are today, but it hasn't brought us far enough. So I think we need to take the next turn of the wheel on capitalism and democracy. And I think this repurposing of resources and alignment of interests across sectors is really fundamental. So the size of the vision kind of evolved, and it didn't jump out of my head this way, but, if in 5 years I could imagine new impact, we'd be no bigger than 100 people. But we'd be, the TSI, trisector innovation, would be being taught in 2,000 universities globally, all the business schools, all the public policy schools. There would be an army of undergraduates and graduate students who were steeped in this. If you go up to the next level, you could imagine all the incubators and accelerators in the world, and there's lots of incubators and accelerators, from famous ones like Y Combinator to 1871 in Chicago to Blue Ridge in New York, but there's thousands that every incubator would have a module, a content that says we're going to treat people TSI as part of all the other things you learn in those things. I think there's a massive investment opportunity. I think every venture fund out there could be looking at their portfolio companies, every private equity fund. And then moving up the food chain, if you think about the world's biggest companies, right, the Fortune 500 or, Fortune 1000 or Global 2000, that's where most of the resources in the world are buried. And if you can get some of those really big organizations to move just a little bit, not even a lot, but if they could just start to play with TSI in some areas, then they can actually change the world quite quickly. So then the question is so that's private sector stuff. But then you can imagine, let's take our city of Seattle. What if the city of Seattle thought about solving homelessness and looking at all the resources in the sectors of the TSI approach? And we actually did a project with the University of Washington, the Evans School, around this. So what if a city adopts it, or a county, or a state? And what if a state's job is to kind of help organize and create a platform like this? And then think about the social sector. Think about all the foundations out there. What if every community foundation was trained in TSI and helped their grantees think this way? So the vision's huge, right? It's basically every organization in the world, and we think the right level to make the change at is at the business model for these organizations. So, yeah, it's a huge vision, and there's just a little tiny C3 with big ideas. So, but to get there, we have to figure out, what's our own model? How do we fund? How do we scale? And what I've learned is that what we do is not a natural fit for the nonprofit sector. People like tangible things, fund wells in Africa that do this, or, things that are specific and measurable. And very few foundations are oriented towards, let's fund a new way of thinking and a new set of tools. But I think they ought to be thinking that way because it's high leverage, right? We're not going to get enough change in the world unless we use a different lever. One of the reasons we hang out around accelerators or incubators is that you get these early stage entrepreneurs who are really hungry and really motivated, and they tend to get after things. So we're very eager to support them, and then also we hope they'll attract capital and grow faster. But it'll still take them 5 or 10 years to scale, which is why we'd like to see medium-sized organizations, and especially the big ones, start to play with this. So the bigger the organization, sometimes the harder it is to drive change at scale. So these are things we're learning.
It's so cool to me that you're still learning, because even though Coinstar was so successful and you did it already, and then now you're doing new impact.
I can mention my dad, who's working on 99. I guess I had a perception when I was younger that at some point I'll have it figured out or whatever. And I realized, no, I'm always going to be figuring it out. That's kind of the journey that we're all on, right? It's just this constant figuring it out and enjoying it along the way.
Can I actually ask you some more questions about you?
Sure.
Because we've talked about Coinstar and New Impact, but I want to know about you. And you may have mentioned this already, but one of the core questions of my podcast is finding people's crucible moments. So an inflection point, maybe a choice you made or an event that happened outside your control that really changed the trajectory of your life. And what was that moment for you that if it hadn't happened, maybe your life would look completely different?
It doesn't. Let me give you a little bit of a different answer to that, because I get asked for career advice with people changing, and just it's happening more and more these days. And I often tell people that life is a series of highways and intersections. And when you're on a sort of a superhighway and you're executing, you have a lot of time to assess options. When I was on the Coinstar superhighway, I wasn't, I didn't know anything else was going on other than I was all coins all the time. And right now I'm in an execution phase too, but there have been periods of your life when you're finished one thing, right? Like I was finished with Coinstar, and you come to this intersection. And I think intersections are really important because all of a sudden you got all these choices. There's all these paths. There's all these ways you can go, all these opportunities you have. But at the same time, there's a bunch of cars coming. You're dodging traffic. It doesn't feel particularly safe to hang out in the intersection. But what I tell myself and when I tell other people, if you can tolerate hanging out in those moments of indecision and uncertainty, or maybe coming off of a failure or success, and learn in those moments, you'll soon be on another path, right? But there's value in those moments of being unsure or feeling anxious or being upset, and learning from them and making sure that you're getting the most out of them. And so when I've hit those times in my life, I'm like, okay, may not feel terrific, but what is it that I can learn here? And before I rush through this to get, just be on a straight and narrow path again, hang out in the intersection. That's something that I've learned to do, and I encourage other people to do it, and I encourage myself to do it too, even though it feels like I just want to do something to get out of this particular mode.
That's beautiful. I love that. And it fits in so well with your trisector model somehow. I'm just imagining the intersection.
Well, like sometimes you're dodging cars, and sometimes there's a lot of cars coming at you, and they're not very friendly.
Oh,
sometimes
that's
too.
true.
So it's like, okay, how do you get through these periods of time? But it's also a matter of, what do you pay attention to and what do you value and what's important to you. Those things are grounding. I'm a big believer in having, a vision for yourself, a vision for your organization. In school, I got taught about something called the Collins-Porras Vision Framework, which is a vision combines three things. So a purpose, a why, a mission, a what, and a values, how. And every organization I work with, I'm always trying to go through the why, the what, and the how. But I do that for myself, too.
Can
right?
I ask what yours are?
Well, I was wondering.
Or is that too personal?
Well, so I was thinking on the way in, like, you might ask me that question. It is personal, but I can give you a fairly good answer.
Okay.
So, and I'm going to borrow, Stephen Covey was big, Seven Habits. It was big in the 90s, and we used a lot of Stephen Covey work. Shout out to some of my Coinstar co-founders for that, and thank you. And I think he talked about live, love, learn, and leave a legacy. And I think those are fairly universal. So when I think about, and I've got a few more, so a good day for me or a good life looks like, live every day so that you feel like when you go to bed you've made good choices in the moment, which is surprisingly hard to do, and make sure you're getting outside. Love, there's, that's important. The people in your life who are important that's important. So the opportunity to love and be loved, I think is important. Laughter, you got to laugh and have some fun with this because, it's a short journey and then it's over. The learning piece, right? So always being curious around that. He uses the word legacy. I would say contribution. So feel like you're making a contribution. So those would be things that's sort of what this, things look like. And the ones I'd add to that are dance. I'm a terrible dancer, and at 6'7", I never want to see a video of myself dancing. But I think music and dancing's
I love dance too.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
I think adventure is really important in my life. So I try to take adventures, generally outside, with friends, sometimes alone. But I like hiking, biking, skiing, new things. So you can't do that all the time in your life. 'Cause I think that would be a very different life. But I think you got to have a sense of adventure. And then one I've added the last few years is seek beauty every day. So no matter what I'm doing, I try to seek some form of beauty in my life, either in a form, in an object, in in a person and an experience. And I find that very centering, to think about seeking beauty daily. So live, love, learn, legacy or contribution, laugh, dance, adventure, and seek beauty. Those would be the things that
That's beautiful.
I think make up a good life.
I love that. That does sound like a good life. I love looking for the little things too, because then they add up, and it's what you do daily. It's
just a series of moments, right?
Exactly. I heard what you do in a day is what you do in your life.
Yeah.
Do you have any regrets?
Well, any regrets? I don't dwell a lot on regret. I mean, if I were to think about things I wish I'd done sooner, I wish I'd established a daily routine sooner in my life between meditation and yoga and having quiet time. In the morning, I read somewhere, I forget who it is, I think Bezos or some famous CEO doesn't take meetings before 11 o'clock in the morning. And I was like, wow, that's an interesting idea. And sort of reserving those first couple hours. I start my work days at 10, unless I'm doing international stuff.
Are you a night owl?
No. I used to be, but now I'm very much of get to bed. You know, if I'm lights out at 9:30 or 10, that's good. I just function better. And I like getting up. I like getting up early. If I can be awake, 5:30 or 6 or 6:30, that's a good day. And I sleep with the window open with cold air. That's very important. Colder the better. Warm blanket, but
yes.
but cold room. So I think regrets. I wish I'd started that earlier. I wish I had read and would still read more wisdom literature. I think the experience we all have as humans is it's odd. I mean, it's both super common. We all have the same experience, and we're all super unique at the same time. But I think that, the great wisdom literature of the world, there's a lot of wisdom in it, and I don't think we're that different from people 100 years ago or a few hundred years ago, and people had time to think and write down stuff. I think that's important to pay attention to and to learn from. We don't have to learn all the lessons ourselves every time owner. We can, whatever, stand on the shoulders of people who came before us and hopefully contribute to the people who come after us. So routines, wisdom literature. I was going to joke and say flossing, floss every day.
That's important. Makes a big difference.
Well, it's funny, like during COVID, I read that book called Atomic Habits.
Yes, James Clear.
Love that book.
I love it too.
Yeah. And it's really more than just about habits. And I was like, okay, I'm going to define myself as a person who, flosses. So like a lot of his little techniques, like I put my Kindle out on my pillow for reading at night and stuff. And it just was, I started with flossing. And I was like, okay, habits build. And I loved his thing about like compounding, sort of, 1%. So if I want to work on something, I'm like, okay, today I'm going to make it 1% better than yesterday. But I'm going to do it consistently. So 100 days from now, it's going to be a lot better. I don't have to do it all right now, right? But I have to do it consistently. So.
And it's so similar to your trisector Coinstar model. I'm sorry, I keep tying it back to that, but it's
tell me,
so
I hadn't made that connection. How do you see clear work tying into trisector stuff?
Well, like when you add up, well, I guess this is more Coinstar, but when you add up the 1% every day, or you add up small habits, but then you're also taking, like, for example, I forget what it's called, but it's basically where you do like a cue or a trigger, and so you're connecting things. Like for me, when I wake up, I'll do like one push-up, or when I walk through the doorway, I'll do like a push-up. And so it's like you take resources from every aspect of your life, and then they remind you to do new, and then you kind of build on it using existing life structures and habits.
So one of my morning routines is I have a little physical routine, and one of them is I do planks, right? And so using the James Clear theory, every day I go 5 seconds longer, right? So if I can go, if I made it 2 minutes 45 seconds this morning, great. But I could have gone longer, but I don't. I only like to do 2:45 today, and then tomorrow I'll do 2:50. Right?
That's actually really impressive.
But if you just start with 5 seconds, right, and then do 10 seconds tomorrow, right?
So before you know it, you'll be planking for a few days.
Well, I think last year I did it a lot, and then I had a little reversion, but I think I made it up to 4 minutes and stuff.
Wow.
But what's interesting to me, I guess, is he's got a methodology and a mindset, right? And look how powerful his work has been, because he can change the mindset. And he's done a really good job of making it simple and actionable. And sort of, our job at New Impact is we don't, even this term trisector innovation throws people off, but it's the term that we use. But just basically using common sense to use all the resources out there. How do we make that really easy and habit forming? How do we make that the conversation that every strategy consultant asks, or every boardroom is asking their management team, or every management team is developing trisector strategy? So we haven't figured out how to do that yet. If we could be as effective as James Clear in terms of getting these habits out there, I'd be very happy about that.
I hope to see it happen too, because when you say it's common sense, I'm like, yeah, I feel like this is something that people can integrate because we already have it. They just need to see it.
Right. So let me just tell you what we're super excited about.
Okay.
So what we have learned with New Impact and TSI is we can show up in a classroom or a workshop, and we do workshops for a bunch of different organizations, and we can do a 3-hour workshop, we can do a full-day workshop, we can do half-day workshop, and then follow-ups, do lots of type of stuff. People get really excited, right? Oh, we want to do this, right? And then they get into the work, and I can tell you all these great stories about models. Oh, we take this database from here and that distribution, and we put them all together, and it's it's easy, right? The problem is when you're starting with a mess of all these loose pieces of Legos laying all around, you don't know where the stuff is. So trying to if we can organize the world's resources around the outcomes we want, which is a simple management thing, measure what you manage and organize around impact, then it should be a lot easier to find stuff. So one of the things I've been talking to the UN about is imagine if all the world's resources were organized by the SDGs or by some other impact index, and you could have a bunch of them in there. So in Seattle, you could say, well, who's on the team for food insecurity in Seattle? And they'll tell you the city resources and county resources and supermarkets and all that sort of good stuff. But that's a lot of work, right, to do that. And we started building this thing called the Wiki by hand with graduate students, building all this stuff out. And we've got it up on Amazon, and it's tagged and stuff. But now we think we can potentially use that as training data into a large language model. So we've been just messing around now for a couple months. And if anybody knows AI and wants to help us, we'd love to help. But we did this last week, and we're like, for these teams, we were able to show them 15 or 20 organizations that had very specific resources which were relevant, right? So not only were the teams excited about the work and they think it's common sense, but we gave them some easy on-ramps. And there's all this talk about AI for good and all these worries about AI, and we think that if we could build this at scale, either with an existing LLM or have to get a new one built, which is very expensive, hopefully with the existing ones, we think it could be a tremendous resource out there. So I'm particularly optimistic right now that the technology might be here to help us organize resources to make it easy for people to do these TSI models. So we've learned that it's hard. We think there's a path towards making it easier now, and now we're just eager to scale it, right? So.
And it's fascinating to me because I'm always like, wow, like so many things have been invented in the world, but there are also so many resources that are underutilized. And I feel
hugely
like
underutilized.
Yes. And I feel like your model is such an effective way of bringing in and including those resources and making them maximally useful.
Well, I'll give you a story on that. And I don't know if you would have heard this in some of your research, but we had this was a project we did several years ago in Detroit with General Motors and University of Michigan Ross School and I think Ford School of Public Policy. And we were just kind of curious about, what GM was up to. And at that point in time, they had something called OnStar, which was a satellite network in their cars. And I think they built it to make restaurant reservations. This is a bit of an old story. So you could sit in your car and hit this blue button and you get an OnStar operator and you could get advice. And so this is before sort of the days of, really great smartphones. And we knew about it, and it was really cool. So we were touring the OnStar operation centers and all these global calls coming in, and there's 30 people answering calls. And we were asking them, we're curious, what else can you do here? And they're like, well, it turns out that we have, if a car gets in a crash and an airbag goes off, we can actually call the local 911 and emergency response. So I'm like, oh, cool. Private sector is actually activating a public sector resource for that. And then someone said, we also have sensors in the car that sense the telemetry of the crash, so we can tell the first responders expect head injuries. We're like, well, that's really cool. And when we were in there, it was during Hurricane Harvey in Texas, and they're getting calls from the Red Cross and from FEMA. And we're like, why on earth are the Red Cross and FEMA calling General Motors? And they said, oh, well, when in times of these sort of natural disasters and the cell network goes down, something, and I'm not a technologist here, but something about the way GM programmed the cars with the antenna, they can actually get a cell signal out on the GM car, and first responders knew this. So Red Cross and FEMA people would run to General Motors cars because they could get a line out. So in this case, you have a private sector company that built sort of a restaurant reservation system, but the federal government was using it as a backbone for emergency communications. So we're like, well, that's pretty cool. There's a resource that was built for one thing that's being repurposed, right? So we kept on asking questions like, what else can you do? And they said, well, we're all trained in suicide prevention. And we're like, well, tell us more about that. And the story they shared was heartbreaking, but also heartwarming. And they said that a lot of vets, returning vets, had a brand affinity for Chevy pickups. And so they would, if they came back and got in trouble with PTSD, they wouldn't call the crisis hotline. They'd sit in their Chevy pickup and hit the blue button. They'd call General Motors. And I'm like, wow, General Motors is on the front line for suicide prevention. And they're like, yeah, it's just the right thing to do. But then we started talking to a couple counselors, and they're like, oh my God, 17% of the cars in the U.S. or whatever the number was at the time have a mental health helpline in it. How can we be helpful to GM? So there's a case where GM built a resource for one purpose, and it was being used many, many, many times over, and the government didn't have to rebuild it, and the counselors didn't have to rebuild it. But that story, I think, can be applied to many resources out there. And as humans, we're really good at what I'd say repurposing. We can look at things and say, well, what else can I do with this?
Yes.
And part of what we're trying to tap into with human ingenuity is if we can put enough examples in front of people with enough resources, and we can say, if you controlled this resource, what would you do with it? Or how could this resource, which was built for housing, also be applied to mental health or food and stuff? And it turns out we're pretty good at that with our brains. So we're just trying to get more of that going. And of course, if that works at scale, then we get back to this fundamental economic principle, which is like, this is a way to pay for things, right? I get so frustrated in my life with these endless debates about, raise taxes and cut spending, right? All of which are important. But nobody's talking about repurposing, being smarter with the resources that we have. And it's just sitting there for us, right?
Exactly.
It's literally sitting in front of us, and we're not able to activate it as a society yet. And I really hope this starts to happen, because I think that, I think in the U.S. alone, the country could get a lot better, and we can address some of the big issues, whether it's affordable housing or mental health. We can get after these things. But I also think people would feel better about what's going on if people feel like we're just being smarter and wiser and working together. So I've spent some time in D.C., kind of pounding the table saying, and there's good work going on in D.C. We've met some really talented people. But, their first challenge is, how do we get the federal government to coordinate across the agencies? I'm like, that's great. It's great to get the Veterans Department and Department of Defense and HHS and, all working together. That's important. But if you don't take a trisector mindset, you're going to sub-optimize it. You got to think about the person's needs first, and they might need access to resources from the federal government or a state government or a county or a city. So think about all those resources. They might need resources from a social sector organization, whatever that is, and they might need resources from a company. So unless you design with the person's needs, at the center, right, and be agnostic about the sectors, you're always going to sub-optimize. They were asking me, how did Propel become so successful? It's like, because they used a trisector model. They thought about the person, they pulled in the resources that were necessary, right? So we need to get, all of our government levels, and whether we start at a state, great to see Washington State doing this. We could organize Washington State around climate. But we got to get some examples going as cities, counties, states, or federal agencies who are thinking with the TSI piece. We need to get more pilots going. We need to be celebrating these things. We need to have tracks at conferences. We need to have lots more podcasts. We got to get more research done. But this is an opportunity for all of us. And that's what we're trying to help spark.
And you're cutting a lot of dead weight loss, too. A lot of that transaction weight. I'm just sitting here being like, whoa, because now all my economics terms and classes are rushing back in. I'm like, wow, this is actually like economics being applied for good.
Right. And I think just going back to the World Bank conversation, the group that got so interested was the economics group and the billions to trillions effort. And they're like, hey, if we're going to put a $100 million loan out to a developing country, and that country can activate its own resources and maybe other international resources that could be 4 or 5 times more, that we get incredible leverage on our loan if we can teach every one of the loan recipients to build the TSI model. So we've been, suggesting that when they create these, what they call them technical support facilities, there ought to be TSI, as a core component of these technical support facilities, so these organizations that are taking the loans can learn to think this ways. But it needs to have a common database that's open. And one of the reasons we're so dedicated to New Impact being a public good is we don't want, we think if it gets privatized that it won't scale, which is a weird thing to say. Why would a nonprofit scale better than a for-profit? But in this case, I think we need this open public good access point so that it can scale rapidly in a lot of places. But coming back to your point, it is about the economics. And if you think about the way the world works, economics drives a lot of it. And so we think we have a core economic principle here that's fairly obvious, but we're not doing it.
It's that, I think you mentioned the public good, and that was a huge core concept that we learned, that like there's just so much in the world that is abundant, but we see it as scarcity. Yeah. But money and tools and resources, those are just tools. That's just a currency.
I 100% agree. We talk a lot about the abundance mindset because we talk to groups and like, oh, there's not enough money, there's not enough resources. And we're trying to get people to shift to thinking there's actually an abundance of resources. You just can't see them, and they're hard to find. And we're trying to make them more visible, both technically visible, so you can, oh my God, there's this really cool database at the EPA about, biodegradable fuels or whatever. One person cares about that, but 10 people might. How do you actually find that? So how do you make it easy to find it, and how do you get people to wear the right pair of glasses so that they're looking for it? Right. The more you look out there, the more resources you realize there are, and it is an abundance mindset.
Yes, and it's so powerful because especially for a lot of people, scarcity is the norm. It's like there's never enough, or especially if you're experiencing poverty, right. that is the pinnacle of scarcity. But then I love how when you are able to connect these sectors, then even more abundance is not only created, but is more visible because now you're connecting things.
Yeah, there's some, and sometimes it's hard to get there because you run into some really established thinking, and that you got to break down or think differently. Right. I won't go into it here because it's a long piece, but we, on our website, we have several catalyst projects that we've done as research for foundations. And one of my favorite ones is this thing that we call creating a public utility for food insecurity. And for listeners who are really interested in food insecurity, I'd encourage them to look at them. We're hoping to get a bunch of pilots coming up. But the point of me mentioning that is there are radical ideas that are in it. And when I start to explain to people, it's a 2-hour conversation on its own. And people call you a socialist and a communist. And I'm like, no, it's a long time to get there. But, be willing to think differently and then to be able to test really pragmatic things. It turns out that's hard to do. And we need to get better at that as a society. I think the U.S. is well positioned to do this, but we just got to start doing it a little bit faster. We're just so wrapped up in the political fighting as opposed to problem solving. And I just wish we were more in problem solving mode or opportunity finding mode.
Do you have any examples of ways that you creatively problem solve or things that have worked for you in your life?
I guess I'll mention a couple things. I had an amazing teacher in high school, a guy named Robert Fulgham, who wrote the book Everything I Know in Kindergarten. I took graphics classes from him, which wasn't my strength, but it was just interesting. And he taught me that kind of bubble charting thing. So just have a big piece of paper and just do sort of the networking map as opposed to using an outline. And I found that to be really helpful to sort of create these, just go where your brain works in a set of neural networks. So, just draw the network out on the page, and that seems to work better for me. So that's a technique that I use for thinking. And I had another answer. I just forgot what it was.
Okay.
But there are other things that I do just to try to, oh, I know what it was. So the other is there's work from I think he's British, guy named Edward de Bono. And I think, I might get this wrong, you can fact check it later, but I think he's the guy who came up with this whole story of think outside the box. So I won't spoil it for your listeners, but he has this 9-dot game that I'll play with classes. You put 9 dots in a square, and you have to solve it. You have to draw a straight line. You get 4 straight lines, and you can't take your pen off the paper. And you have to go through all 9 dots. And it's non-obvious. But he goes through it, and there's a way to do it with 4 lines. And his message is that people brought constraints to the problem that they were unaware of. So he kind of advocated for write down your restraints and then relax them systematically. So you kind of teach that little 9-dot problem. We could do it if you wanted to. But then you say, okay, now that you've learned this creative process, because he was teaching creativity, now do it with 3 lines. And everyone's like, oh my God, it's impossible. But it's the same thing. You have to write down, you have to figure out what your other constraints are, right, and then relax them. And it can be done with 3 lines, which is really interesting. And he did this for years. And the story I heard about it was apparently there was some lecture where after he'd done this, 4-line thing and 3-line thing, and everyone's like, okay, write down constraints and teach creativity. Some young girl raised her hand and said, I can do it in 1 line. And he immediately dismissed her, not even following his own thing. And she showed him a way to do it with 1 line by relaxing a constraint. So if I get stuck on a problem and I need creative solutions, I'll try to step back and write down what are the constraints, what are my assumptions or my constraints to this way of thinking, and list them literally. In the 9-dot game, it's the paper, it's the pen, it's the size of the dots or the constraints that are out there in your mindset. And then to kind of work through an organized process. And I find that can be helpful for removing roadblocks. So Edward de Bono, that's an old thing, probably not that popular these days, but I think he's where think outside the box came from. Oh,
wow. That's so cool.
Yeah.
I have a strange question for you.
Okay.
So you have this really out-of-the-box thinking, and you have all these ways of problem solving and looking at the world in new ways. And you're also 6'7". So do you think that you have a bird's eye view on the world? Do you think that has anything to do with it? How do you see the world? How do you experience it?
So I get a lot of questions about height, and a lot of jokes. I've never gotten that question in my life. So kudos for a unique height question.
Unique height question. Well, I'm really short, so I experience the other end of the spectrum.
I don't think so. I mean, it's true that I have a great view in a crowd, and that's helpful.
You probably see things other people don't, though, right? Because you have that, you can see the big picture.
I have a joke that I like, which is I think we all have a PhD in something. There's some unique skill we all have, and I have a PhD in refrigerator tops. So I see the tops of everybody's refrigerators, and I know how dirty they are or not. I also have a PhD in changing light bulbs because friends used to I'd come over to their house and they would change the light bulbs for me. So yeah, I see things differently, but maybe more than the height. Let me come back to where we started on immigration, which is, my sisters and I have talked about it, a lot, and we never felt like we quite fit in. We didn't feel like the typical American family because we had strong Danish traditions and whatnot. So there was this sense that we had a kind of a foot in both camps. And I really value the time. I've spent, a year plus of my life in Denmark, and they operate differently there. And I appreciate their perspective on the U.S., but I'm very happy I'm, born and raised in the U.S. because I've been afforded lots of opportunities here that I wouldn't have there. So I think there's maybe more to looking at it a little bit differently, is feeling like a little bit of an outsider. Maybe we all feel like outsiders. But one of my sisters in particular and I have talked a lot about this sense that we didn't quite fit in, and we think it's because of that. Mom and Dad were learning the language and had accents, and they didn't have the customs down. They didn't know the things that were sort of more typical. So we were always kind of figuring it out as we went with it. It's funny. I worked on I served on the advisory board for the University of Washington, Bothell, several years ago, which I really enjoyed a lot. And they were talking about first-generation college students, and they were going through the stats and stuff. And I had not realized in my life that I was a first-generation immigrant college student. Somehow my parents raised us with that. This wasn't a thing. And I was like, wow, that's really quite a story that they immigrated, had $50 in their pocket, took the Greyhound bus across the country, got pickpocketed in the Cleveland Greyhound station, which I've gone to visit, had to borrow the money to get to Seattle, and managed to get all 4 of their kids educated.
Wow.
There was a lot of gumption in making that happen.
That's really powerful. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Happy to.